Water users on the eastern Snake River Plain are hailing the Joint Finance Appropriation Committee's approval of $30 million in ongoing water project funding. Last month, our lead producer Melissa Davlin sat down with Blackfoot farmer Brian Murdoch to discuss the importance of the infrastructure investment.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, how would you describe the problem that kicked off negotiations last year?
It was very unique last year, especially because we had a very good winter. We had lots of snow that came a little later, and then it started actually flooding. And so it was probably the first time in history we've ever had the flood warnings come out on the same news cycle as then a curtailment notice that we were all going to be curtailed. So
and a
very
curtailment
unique.
notice, for people who aren't familiar with water issues, is basically you can't use the water that you have the rights to right now until the senior water rights holders are able to use theirs.
Yes, they came out, and this was what we called the red tagging, or tagging of our pumps, in which they told us to basically cease and desist and not run these pumps to irrigate our crops. Of course, by then the crops was already planted. In fact, they were already up. They were at a very vulnerable stage of plant growth, and so that was also one of the major problems of last year, is the timing.
And roughly how many people were affected by these curtailment orders?
Oh, pretty much all of East Idaho. There was over 6,000 farms we figured that was impacted by it. We've all jumped around with various numbers, depends on what you include, what you don't include. I've heard, as low as 500,000 acres and as high as 900,000 acres. And, they're all kind of right. It just depends on what you want to include.
So this kicked off negotiations with a whole lot of stakeholders at the table, including IDWR and senior water rights holders and junior water rights holders in eastern Idaho. What were your issues with how those negotiations went?
Well, the biggest problem we had was legally, we were checkmated. And this is where, as Director Weaver says, I had to do this curtailment. And legally, he was probably correct. I argue that he could have, if we want to stay with the legal terms, we've all heard of continuances or some other hearings that would have postponed it, or we could have dealt with this in the winter months rather than right in the middle of the summer months. And that's when we're, of course, very busy. But they chose to do it when they did, and so we didn't really go into it with a strong negotiation point. As Frank Vandersloot said at this meeting that we had back in July, he says, they're literally holding our gun to our head saying, now negotiate. There wasn't too much that we could negotiate with other than, I guess we'll see what we can come up with to mitigate or to appease these senior groundwater users down in Twin Falls.
At some point, like you said, there's only so much water, and legally, the director at IDWR, Director Weaver, had to work within the framework that already existed. Was a continuance a realistic possibility if there was already a shortage?
Well, and this was one of the groundwater users always went back to. Yes, legally, they were also showing a shortage. Due to the fact that there was so much water in the river, all us farmers knew that those farmers in Twin Falls were not going to be crop impacted. Maybe they were legally impacted, maybe they weren't getting their full water share during all this water, because of the spring flows, coming out of the aquifer. But there was plenty of water in the river for them to irrigate their crops. We don't necessarily, Farmers don't like to hurt other farmers. That's just not in our nature. We are a small group, we're getting smaller. And so no one wanted to see and wants to see any grower in Twin Falls on that canal system be short of water. I really think that there's a lot of probably reciprocal sympathy that they didn't necessarily want to see us all end up in the position that we were in, but at the same point in time, I think they had their lawyers saying, no, you got to do this.
You mentioned the impacts on crops, and a whole lot of people, especially in eastern Idaho. At the end of the summer, did you see any real impact on the crops, or were you still able to have a decent year?
Let's put it this way. Probably a majority of the farmers weren't good citizens and didn't shut off like we were supposed to. There was a week to 10-day period in which we technically were in violation if you were pumping water. There were probably 10 to 15% of the farmers that were afraid of the fines and the penalties, and so they did. But probably the vast majority did not. And I kind of joked that the Department of Water Resources was saying, we're going to shut you off, but please don't injure yourself. But we got it back on, and so therefore I really don't feel like anyone suffered crop injury from this short curtailment.
Because of those short-term actions where the governor is hoping that this year's legislature appropriates $30 million in ongoing funds specifically for recharge projects, and he did cite recharge projects in the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. Is that enough to address these concerns for stability moving forward?
It's a good start. How's that? We haven't had that much money ever spent on recharge projects in East Idaho. The State Water Board, as you know, who is in charge of allocating this money, and they've been playing with roughly $10 million. In the past, we have not received, let me rephrase that. The State Water Board over the years has had somewhere over $200 million, in which what has been actually spent in East Idaho is probably less than 14 or somewhere around $14 million. A lot of that money has been spent on other projects in other parts of the state. The Anderson Dam, raising that one, ate up $100 million. And of course, a lot of this was that ARPA funds, and so this was actually federal money that the State Water Board was reallocating. And so, we just haven't, unfortunately, felt like we've been getting our fair share necessarily. I believe that had more been spent earlier, we maybe wouldn't have been in this position we are in right now.
But there's no money in the budget for a time machine.
Yep.
So moving forward, do you think this is enough, or is it just a start?
Well, let's put it this way. I did some napkin math. How's that? I figured that the East Idaho farmers are spending between $15 and $20 million of our own money to fight this water fight right now. And unfortunately, a lot of that, I would call it Band-Aid and lawyers, because it's not solving it. We just keep moving and kicking the can down the road with all these water fights we've had. We now have an opportunity. This is what the governor has given us, is we have an opportunity to start to fix this problem. I'm a big believer that I use a pie analogy. Idaho has been eating out of the same pie forever, and all we do is we bake a pie and then we start to divide up the slices. And because of the growth, because of the expansion, because of the needs, everybody's slices is getting smaller and smaller. And so I think that we need to actually, and this is what I'm hoping we can do with the $30 million, is start to make another pie, and to where we actually expand the resource. This is what our pioneer ancestors did. They went out, they had the rivers, they said, let's build reservoirs, let's have canals, we'll put in ditches, and we'll spread this resource out, and unintentionally, we started to build up the aquifer. And that was a great thing. We didn't probably even really understand what we were doing back in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And of course, lately the science has got us to where we understand now the aquifer a lot better. And of course, ever since we've stopped those irrigation style of practices, the aquifer has went down a bit. This 40 or 30 million, which if you add it to the 10 million on ongoing funds is actually the 40 million, this can start to get these recharge projects going that we need to have to where we can recharge the aquifer back up to these levels that we need for the growth.
And it's not all about money, of course. Are there any policy changes you would like to see, or anything you'd like to do to make sure that money is directed toward the aquifer?
There's lots of policy changes. We one of the problems, like what I just said, legally, for instance, the director did what he needed to do because he was legally bound. I was hoping throughout the session of the legislature we could get lots of these little policy tweaks and changes done. There are getting to be a few of them, and we've got some of these bills going through. I'd like to see more, of course, but these changes are slow. And there's lots of fights over, what we're doing. It's just like the funding. We're trying to hold on to this funding, especially this funding for the East Idaho or the East Snake Plain Aquifer, which is where at the moment is the current largest water fight going on in the state. Unfortunately, that water fight is affecting the economy, can affect the whole economy of the whole state. And this is why it is important that we get this solved and get moving forward again.
We've been talking about this in terms of solving problems within the state, but last week when Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke was on, I asked if he was concerned about the federal government meddling in Idaho's water management. We saw several weeks ago that President Trump issued an executive order to release water from 2 storage dams in California. Are you concerned in one way or another about the federal government meddling in Idaho's water fights?
Always concerned. Anytime you have the federal government, of course, there's concerns they can do things that nobody else can. And we have seen through flood control releases and stuff like that, them meddling at times that has really hurt us. So yes, I think we need to keep a weather eye as to what is being talked about in the federal government for Idaho's water.
Brian Murdoch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.